everyone, how you doing today? My name's Kirsty, aka Beth Bookish, and on today's video we are going to be discussing disability pride and giving recommendations for each of the colours of the disability pride flag. I am going to admit I am late to this. I've had this video planned for pretty much the entirety of July, and then my own disabilities kind of scuppered those plans, because if you are new to the channel, I have been formally diagnosed with severe chronic migraine, IBS, but they now think that it's not IBS. They think it could be Crohn's disease and ADHD. I am self-diagnosed autistic because it's going to cost too much money or take too much time to go through the system to get diagnosed, but I know that I am autistic. And I am currently undergoing investigation further into the migraines because they seem to have started affecting my balance, dizziness, sometimes my cognitive ability. We're currently undergoing investigations into Crohn's disease, into my migraines to find out why they're getting worse and why my medication stopped working, and also looking into the possibility of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So yay, I have multiple symptoms, multiple things. I currently have been unable to work since January because of it. I've been signed off work because of it. And yeah, we're just at that stage where we know there's problems. I've been referred to all the specialists and none of them are getting back to me. So that is the state of the current medical system in the UK, and it's not their fault. I don't blame them. I just wish it would get fixed a bit sooner so I can get fixed. That would be great. Anyway, because obviously I consider myself disabled and the government considers me disabled, I do try to read some disabled books when I can. I've read a variety. There are some that I wrote down for this that I've decided not to talk about because I don't think they were good representations, and so I don't want to recommend them. What I'm going to do is talk through the different colours of the flag, what they represent, what disabilities they represent, and then recommend some books and manga that I have read that contain them. I'm also aware that there are still some things behind me that have things in, so The Summer You Were There, I am convinced it's going to have something medical, but in the first volume, which is all I've read, there isn't any mention of medical stuff. There's only kind of like the tiniest hint that tells you there's something bad with one and something wrong with one of the girls. So I haven't included it because until I've read it and know exactly what it is that she's got wrong, I don't really want to talk about it. So, you know, books like that and series like that where maybe it's not prominent or I haven't yet discovered exactly what the disability is, those haven't been included for this video. Anyway, I've talked enough, well, introed enough, let's get on. The first colour of this flag is green, and these represent sensory disabilities, so being hearing impairments, sight impairments, anything that has that sort of sensory element to it, those kinds of things. And the books that I have, I'm not going to lie, I think all of these are deaf rep. Yeah, all of these are deaf rep. I don't seem to have read anything that has sort of any other sensory. Please do give me some recommendations, especially for this one, because I haven't really read anything with like blind rep. So that's something that I would like to read. So if you have any recs, please link them all below. So for this one, I'm starting with I Hear the Sunspot. This follows our main character who is hearing impaired and he really struggles with his hearing. He has an aide in his class assigned to him to basically make notes and take notes for him, and then he ends up falling in love, and it's so cute, it's so wholesome. I really loved how supportive the boyfriend is and how he tries to learn sign language, and I also like that this isn't afraid to show the different sides of what it's like to be deaf. It shows how some deaf people really are opposed to being able to hear, and they really don't like things like cochlear implants. It also shows how some people within the, not all, but some people within the deaf community can be really vile towards the hearing community. Especially there is one scene in particular where they go to a deaf cafe and the boyfriend is trying really hard with what limited sign language he has, and the others are all around him mocking him through sign language because they know that he can't understand. And it was just a really awful, toxic situation. This book series explores all of that in so much detail, and it has a really beautiful romance to go with it, so please do check it out. Next up we have The Sunbearer Trials by Aidan Thomas. In this we have a bunch of competitors who are in a sort of Hunger Games style tournament. One of the competitors is deaf and one of the other competitors communicates with them through sign language, so that's a really interesting aspect to have a deaf person within this kind of situation, and it's like you've got to fight against each other but you're also trying to communicate and support them. We have hearing impairment in the Raven cycle, mostly towards the end of the first book, and then the rest of the books one of the characters does end up with a hearing impairment and that impacts on them, and we do get reference to that throughout the book, and we do get a perspective from that character about how it's affected their life. So that one definitely counts, but it's not like the major plot point, it's just a minor part of the book, but I still feel it was really well done and well represented. And then I also have started, but not finished yet, A Sign of Affection by Sue Morishita, with the main character. She is deaf and she meets this guy and he helps her to grow more confident and explore the world and sort of become more independent, because she's kind of been coddled quite a lot and her parents have been a bit overprotective, so now he's going to help her to overcome that. Next up we have Blue, which is emotional psychiatric disabilities, so these are things like mental health, these are things like anxiety, depression, PTSD, OCD, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, DID, all of those kind of things. And for this one we have a fair stack of books, I'm not gonna lie, there's quite a stack. First one we have is Boyfriend Material by Alexis Hall. Luke is just an anxious bean, okay? And it's not very well managed, not very well controlled, and we do get a lot of anxiety specifically from him that is dealt with. Heartstopper by Alice Oseman has sort of anxiety, depression, mental health, but it also has an eating disorder. One of the main characters also has an eating disorder, which gets explored and discussed in fair detail. Orange is quite a heavy, hard-hitting one about mental health, suicide and depression, and guilt as well, which forms depression. Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. I got it right without having to check. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Finally! This one has different ones. It also has an invisible disability, because there is one of the characters more towards the end of the book has a disability, but the predominant one that I think pops up the most throughout this book is dementia. One of the main characters and one of the patrons of the restaurant has Alzheimer's, and that is discussed, and his wife is like his carer and is also a nurse, so that's discussed quite a bit in here. Under Your Spell by Laura Wood is a romance, however she has a lot of psychological problems, has a lot of anxiety, has a lot of mental health issues, and has struggled with depression. This one I really liked because it actually showed her, and we got to sit in on some of her therapy sessions. And I feel like that's very rarely done in books, where we get told that the character goes to therapy and they sometimes implement their therapy lessons. But it's rare that we actually get to be in the therapy office with them. So I really appreciated that element, and I also related far too much for comfort to Clemmy in this. Enough by Kevin Dorman is a book written in verse, and the main character has just come out of a psychiatric hospital after having tried to commit suicide, and it's a book all about, you know, overcoming mental health and living with mental health and other sort of various aspects within that, and it was really beautifully written. It made me cry. Please do give it a go. And then finally we have Poison Study by Maria V. Schneider, where the main character has got quite severe PTSD, and it's not one of those books where it happens at a nice, neat, convenient time and doesn't really seem to affect her day to day. This is one where the PTSD, it hits whenever, and there are times where she'll be in the middle of something really important and she'll start to have a flare-up of the PTSD and be having a panic attack and things like that. And I thought it was one of the most realistic portrayals of PTSD that I've ever experienced, especially within a fantasy setting. And then finally for this category we have Take a Hint, Danny Brown, where not only does it feature anxiety and mental health, but amazingly, and it needs to be done way more often, the primary focus of that was on the male lead rather than the female. And it was fantastic to have that kind of representation of seeing it from both sides, not just all for the female, as does tend to happen, unfortunately. It does seem to be that more often than not, those kind of things get reflected on the female. So it was nice, and it was quite refreshing to see the anxiety rep for the male perspective as well, and that was just really well done. Next up we have the white sort of part of the flag, and this represents invisible and undiagnosed illnesses. So things like, for myself, it would include migraines, a migraine rep, chronic pain, chronic fatigue, diabetes, cancer, POTS, fibro, Crohn's disease, IBS, anything where it's like you can't immediately look at someone and go, this is what that person's disability is. I have a few, but I don't have anywhere near as many as I would have thought, and unsurprisingly, most of these are contemporary fiction and romance. It's again a thing that I feel like needs to be represented way more in fantasy, because, you know, the amount of battles and fights that a lot of these characters go through, there is no way that they don't have long-lasting impacts of that, such as chronic pain and arthritis and things like that, yet it very rarely gets mentioned. And I'm kickstarting this with another of the Brown sisters, and that is Get a Life Chloe Brown. Chloe has fibro, and when she decides to get her life together, it's after she's had a particularly bad flare-up of her fibro, along with some other stuff that happens. And throughout the book, we do learn about her sort of pain management, and when it gets bad, we experience what it's like for her. This was the first time that I read a book where I felt like my own experiences were being written with chronic health. And it turns out it's because Talia Hibbert herself has got fibro, and so she's writing from her own personal experience, and honestly that makes all the difference. And it actually made me go to my doctor and be like, hey, I have pretty much all the same symptoms as this character, and they were like, possibly. But then nothing really got followed up on that, and that's when I started to think also possibly Ehlers-Danlos, where there's a lot of links to fibro with that. So it's a whole thing. But this book definitely made me think and made me realise there was something wrong with my body, that more than I thought there was. This Wonderful Season with You is a standalone manga. Very cute, very wholesome, but one of the main characters, he is an ex-baseball player who had to quit due to injury, and throughout this book he mentions his shoulder, and we see him struggling with the pains that he's got in his shoulder as a result of that injury. Rootbound by Tara DeWitt, it's not one of the main characters and it comes in more later on in the book, but there is cancer representation in here and they do discuss it in here. As with Days at the Morisaki Bookshop, again, there is quite a lot of discussion about cancer and how that affects people and the kind of grief process that goes along with knowing a family member has this illness. And that is the end of that section. The next one is probably the one that is the most significant for me, and this is Gold, which are the cognitive disabilities, aka ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and other disabilities such as things like strokes, as well as things like Down syndrome and amnesia, that kind of thing. So for this is probably, I think, the biggest section, not only because I do actively try to read books with those kind of reps, because I'm really trying to find books that have, certainly in a lot of media, ADHD is portrayed in a very specific way, and that way is generally very sort of destructive and negative, and focus on how it affects everybody else. They very rarely focus on what ADHD actually does for the person who suffers from it. There are a couple of books that I've read specifically with ADHD rep where I was actively insulted because I'm like, of all the things you could talk about with ADHD, you chose that. And perpetuate that stereotype that just reinforces the negative connotations. So thank you very much for, you know, continuing to demonize something that we cannot control and has multiple layers more than is ever shown. Yeah. I'm starting this with Book of the Year for last year for me, which was The Reanimator's Heart by Kari Jorgensen. This was absolutely fantastic for me in terms of the autism rep. I almost could not describe my own autism any better than she does with Oliver in this book. And just a lot of his fears and insecurities are the same, the ones that I have. A lot of how he reacts to situations were the same as I have. This probably wouldn't have been Book of the Year had I not resonated so deeply and so hard with the main character of this book. So this one was definitely fantastic for the autism rep. We then have The Extraordinaries by TJ Klune. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with TJ Klune that is starting to stray more towards the hate, and I don't think... I'm probably not going to finish this series, and after I've read Wolfsong, which is going to happen this year, but I don't think I'm going to continue, and I don't think going forward he is an author I will read. But I will say The Extraordinaries was the first book I ever read with autism, with ADHD rep, that had me tearing up, because it felt like someone actually understood the complexities, and that ADHD isn't just about being disruptive and causing trouble for everyone. It's actually very deep, and even though, yes, it was told from a boy's perspective, which 90% of ADHD is, because it's still very misunderstood in women. And obviously, it's understandable. The author is male with ADHD himself, so he is using his own life experiences. But I liked how he talked about that complicated self-loathing and self-hatred that a lot of people with ADHD have, because they see themselves as a failure almost constantly, and they feel like they're never able to live up to their potential. Not saying I feel that one at all, but you know. So I will still recommend it for the ADHD rep. I just didn't really like a lot of the other stuff in there. And then for the final, sort of like this bit, we have the final book in the Brown Sisters trilogy. Not only is Jacob, I'm sure it's Jacob, the romantic lead, not only is he openly autistic and talks about it, he also helps Eve to realise that she also may be autistic. So we get the male and the female side, and we see how autism is presented in different people. Because, you know, autism isn't one umbrella, isn't one blanket, it's an umbrella. There are multiple different ways that it presents. It is a spectrum for a reason. But I really liked that it showed that spectrum and it discussed it. It was great. Then we have another ADHD rep fantastic one, and that is Cafe Con Lychee. It talks about Theo, who has it. I think he's on medication, if I remember rightly, but again, it doesn't demonize or add any of the negative stereotypes that go towards it. It explains how the medication actually helps him and stabilizes him. And again, it's another one that does not shy away from the inner personal feelings of someone with ADHD and how they struggle with it. It's not in the book, but it has been confirmed to me by the author. But Julian in Cemetery Boys also has ADHD. And yes, we are shown a lot of the kind of, you know, the explosive personality, the angry reactions to everything and the overreactions to everything. Julian is an extremely emotionally charged little being, which most of us with ADHD are, because emotional regulation, big issue for a lot of us, because that part of our brain has either not been formed properly or is missing altogether in many cases. And so when I asked Aidan Thomas, because I picked up on a lot of the signals and the signs, Aidan came back and said, yes, Julian does have ADHD. And I do like that it shows the sort of the more negative side of it, but it does also show, and it makes a point, certainly from Yadiel's perspective, where he makes a point of saying that yes, he has these tendencies, but he's also fiercely loyal, and a lot of those reactions are out of love and things, and it really reinforced the positives of what it's like to have an ADHD friend or partner. And I just really did appreciate the rep in this. Even I just wish that Aidan had actually openly stated it rather than just implied. Conventionally Yours by Annabeth Albert is very similar to Cemetery Boys in that it doesn't specifically give us a neurodiversity, but it does talk about Alden, who does have neurodiversities. His parents had him tested for multiple things, and while they couldn't settle on a single diagnosis of like autism or anything like that, they have settled on he is neurodivergent, and he does show many signs of neurodivergencies, and that is obviously explained a bit more in the book. Then we have a couple of non-fictions to wrap this one up. The first one is Sensory Life on the Spectrum. This is a comics anthology written and compiled by people with autism, and it shows many different aspects of autism, how people feel with it, how people cope. It has some that are more factual and explain like what autism is, and I felt it very personal. I read this one after I read the next book, which is the book that made me know 100% that I am autistic, and it has helped me come up with a couple of little regulation things for myself. But the book that absolutely made me go 100% I am autistic, there is no denying it, Strong Female Character by Fern Brady. Fern is a comedian from Scotland. She is amazing. If you haven't watched the Taskmaster series that she's on, it's also got Dara O'Brien, Munya Chihuahua, John, I can't remember his surname, and Sarah Millican. And Sarah Millican is like my hero, but now Fern is as well. She was so fantastic, and as she says in this book, the show was the most autistic friendly thing she's ever done. And she was so fantastic in explaining things. I love that she includes loads of sort of footnotes. I don't normally like footnotes, but I did appreciate it with this one because the footnotes all have like, you know, lots of reference materials. She hasn't just come in at it and is spouting random stuff. She has done her research as well as put her personal experiences in, and I found this very touching, and it really cemented that I am autistic and opened a whole new world to me. The next category is red, and that is physical disabilities, so spinal cord injuries, people with using wheelchairs, people with prostheses, MS, epilepsy, cerebral palsy, all of those kind of things all fit into it. Again, I've read quite a few for this, and I'm pleased that there's a few fantasies in here as well. The first one I'm going to talk about is Six of Crows, because Kaz Brecker walks with a walking stick, and he has a physical limp, and he suffers also with chronic pain. And again, it's one that gets displayed throughout the book, and he does talk about it, but it's also one that is based off of the author's own experiences of having these problems. Cinder by Marissa Meyer is another one where the character went through some like body disfiguration and multiple surgeries, and even though she's been turned into a cyborg, she does have like a prosthetic foot, and she has, you know, she's had gears and mechanical things put into her eyes, so you know, she's definitely got some physical disabilities there as well, and it does interfere with her day-to-day goings on. We have My Hero Academia. Throughout this series, things happen to various characters, and many characters end up sort of damaged, mutilated, disabled throughout this series. I'm not going to say names, but there are two in particular that I can think of that in one battle both end up losing limbs and end up needing to use prosthetics from that, but that's pretty far into the series. That's like 37, 38 onwards. But it's still one that I feel is important to mention, that throughout this book there are multiple accidents, injuries and disabilities that appear. Another manga, we have Full Metal Alchemist. Ed and Alphonse, after something goes hideously wrong, Al loses his whole body and ends up in a suit of armour, so his doesn't really count, but Ed, as you can see here, he has a metal arm and he also has a prosthetic metal leg, but he also suffers with a lot of pain from those because when they get damaged, the prostheses are attached to the actual nerves in his body. Therefore, when they get damaged, it basically gives him horrendous pain. One that is a little bit more obscure, and I was struggling where to put this, but I've gone with physical because as someone who struggles with this condition herself, it's physical because you can see it, but it's not necessarily a disability that you immediately would think is a disability, and that is sweat and soap. Now, the main character in this has a condition called hyperhidrosis. It's not mentioned in the book, but I know that's what it's called because it runs in my family. I have it. And this is essentially excessive sweating. She has really bad problems with sweating, and the reason I've put this in and included it is because the definition of a disability is a condition that is ongoing and causes issues with your day-to-day life, and it interferes with day-to-day life. And I can tell you, I can't have bare feet. If I wear shoes and I've got bare feet, I will get such horrific blisters and welts and abrasions. Every single clothing choice I make, I have to think about, is my sweat going to show? It is a physical disability. It impacts your mental health. It makes you self-conscious all the time. It makes you have to, it's costly. You have to buy extra clothes to make sure you've got spares at all times in case you need to change. And so I've included that because it is something that I've struggled with my whole life, and this character has struggled with her whole life. And you see, instead of going out for lunch every day, she goes to the bathroom to get changed and, have a quick strip wash, get changed into a spare set of clothes, re-deodorize, all of that. And I had to do that when I was teaching. The number of times the kids would comment in the afternoon like, "Miss, you're wearing different clothes to earlier." Yeah, guys, it's because I sweat through my previous clothes and I needed to change. It's just a really horrible thing to have to be dealing with. Next up we have the final manga for this section, that is Perfect World by Rie Eruga. This one features the main character who is in a wheelchair, and this book really does focus on the attitudes towards wheelchair users in Japan, as well as showing what it is like to live life as someone with a spinal cord injury, as well as what it's like to be someone who is who wants to date someone with a spinal cord injury while also fighting your own inner prejudices and discrimination that you've grown up with. And then the final one for this section is 16 Stars by Rosa Talbot. I have stated multiple times that I think this is the best example of representing disability I've ever seen. And even though the author herself does not use prostheses like the main character in this one does, she has clearly interviewed people and talked to people with these problems because it was so well represented. The little tiny details where she was even talking about what it's like for Charlie to go from not a flat surface onto cobbled pavement, the way she included those little details. My own mum, when she used to walk with her legs, she couldn't walk on certain surfaces because the transition, it put the balance off, and it made her at risk of falling over. And Charlie has the same problems, and I just loved all those little details that a lot of other authors would have overlooked. So this one is definitely fantastic, and it also does have various other types of rep. It has tiny bit of deaf rep, it has mental health, it just has the whole package, and I cannot wait for the third book to be out so I can binge read the series back to back and probably have my heart ripped out. Finally, the smallest section, but by no means the least significant, is the black section, which is to reflect on those we've lost. I have 3 books. The first of these is Wishful Drinking by Carrie Fisher. She had a lot of issues, and addiction is considered a disability, and she did have problems with alcohol and drugs. She also struggled with mental health and depression, and in later life she did have to use mobility aids for walking around because she wasn't so unsteady on her feet because she'd done a lot of damage to her body. So that one was definitely a very poignant autobiography. And then I've got 2 where it focuses on sort of characters. So I mentioned earlier Days at the Murasaki Bookshop, featuring cancer and what it's like to be someone living with. It's even more explored in the second book, and the second book really does focus on the grief process when you've lost someone who's had such a long-lasting illness. It talks about all the different emotions and feelings of that, so that's why I've included this, because it does focus more on the grief aspect and what it's like to live after someone's gone when they've been suffering and struggling with these disabilities, so that's why I've included this. And then the final one is My Brother's Husband by Gengoro Tagame. This one features Mike, who his husband has died, so he's flown over to Japan to meet his husband's twin brother. It talks a lot about grief, and again, it deals with depression and moving on after somebody you love has died from an illness. It doesn't actually tell us how Ryoji passed, but it does mention that he was sick. And again, I think it shows that kind of grief after losing someone, but it also deals with like mental health as well, and depression and things like that. So this is an extremely long video, but I definitely wanted to acknowledge the fact that it is Disability Pride Month, and I have tried to read more books with disability rep. I am making more of an effort, I've been making even more of an effort in the last couple of years as my own health has declined, because sometimes I read to escape the reality of what I'm going through. Other times I read to kind of take comfort in the fact that even in fantasy and in other like fiction, other people are going through just as much pain and suffering as me, and it's a comfort to sort of go through that with them. Please do let me know in the comments if you've got any further recommendations for me, or if you have seen like my physical TBR tour, if you know of any of the books on there that deal with health and any of these kind of disability reps, that'd be fantastic, so I can get those as a priority. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope maybe if there are any that you haven't yet read and you are looking for specific types of disability rep, hopefully I've given you a few suggestions. Again, please do let me know in the comments if I have managed to give you any suggestions. But in the meantime, I hope you're all good. I hope you're staying safe. Please don't forget to check out both my Patreon and Etsy that are linked below, and I will see you on the next, hopefully much shorter video. Bye!